Today, Professor Kashwan would speak on the topic, the power matrix, researching power and resistance in an era of populist authoritarianism. To introduce Professor Kashwan, I would like to Arvind Kumar, who is a fellow, who was a fellow batchmate of mine, but now a research scholar at the University of Galway, London. So I welcome Arvind to introduce Professor Kashwan to all of us.
Hello, everybody. Welcome on. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, Arvind, you are audible.
Hello, everybody. Welcome on behalf of Foundation for Creative Social Research. Thank you, Priyanka, for giving me opportunity to introduce Dr. Prakash Kashwan, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Department of Political Science at University of Connecticut, USA. Dr. Kaswan means my association with Dr. Kaswan goes back since 2015 when I started working with him on a joint research paper, co-authored research paper on neoliberal reform in India. Dr. Kaswan has authored a very wonderful book, he has authored a very wonderful book. Its name is Democracy in Wood, Environmental Conservatism and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico. This book is published by Oxford University Press, and interesting thing is that this book is nowadays taught across the. I would suggest. I think that this book is taught across the world. In different universities, this book has been recommended as a reading list. Dr. Kaswan works on. He works on environmental movement and new environmental governance, emerging environmental governance, and he sees things from very global perspective. So I would welcome him in this program, and over to you, Prakash.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we begin, I would request all of you to switch off their camera and microphone such that we have a seamless conversation with Professor. And Professor Kashwan, I have been getting requests that your voice is a little bit not clear. So if you can be a little louder, it will be more clear to the audience. Thank you.
Is this good?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me for this seminar. I really appreciate this opportunity given by the Foundation for Creative Social Research, Professor Thakur, Priyanka, and Arvind. Thank you, Arvind, for that introduction, kind introduction. So, I want to get started right away without any pleasantries because we can sort of spend more time talking about other stuff and getting into a Q&A. And so, as Priyanka requested, please mute your microphone so that there's no echo or feedback. So what you see on your screen is a picture from the movie Matrix. So for those of you who have not seen, and I saw it like long time back, so I don't remember the whole movie, but in the beginning, the main protagonist is given an option to pick a red pill or a blue pill. And the context is that the actor is told that you are actually living in a make-believe reality, but you don't realize that. And so if you take this red pill, you will actually see the reality as it is actually is not as how you see it. And the blue pill will allow you to live in your own make-believe world. Now, the twist here is that what this person who's offering the pills, what he calls the real world is actually a make-believe world. Right? So it's a great twist on subjectivities, context, and the sort of the connection or link between structure and the individual. And so one of the underlying theme or arguments that I'm making is about the importance of recognizing the constant nexus and a very important nexus between structure and agency. And different varieties of scholarship on important social, economic, and political questions, they tend to lean either on the structure side or on the agency side. And the problem is that the game happens in between structure and agency. So that's the sort of the main kind of theme here during the presentation. So here is a brief outline of the presentation. I want to start by talking about individuals and their role in politics. And then I will talk about this methodology called institutions and institutional analysis. I'll only sort of give a very brief overview of the methodology and the approach. I won't get into the details. So if you have questions, please do make sure that you clarify questions, because these frameworks and vocabularies are understood very, very differently across different disciplines. Even definitions of institutions vary dramatically from one discipline to another. So I'll try to give a broad overview of the way I use it and the framework that we use in particular form of political economic analysis. That I will use to talk about power and resistance, or the complexity of power and resistance. And then in the vein of concluding, I'll share some reflections on the current moment and how to sort of look forward to a better future. So the point of departure for my whole thinking here is that in recent times, you notice that behavioralism, or some variation of behavioralism, has become quite commonplace. At least, some people regularly draw on a behavioral understanding of politics. So to give you the first example here, the past 3 or 4 years, or maybe even 6 years, has seen emergence of a young journalist who often sort of uses behavioralism to sort of make political commentary. And so one of his more funnier, he does sometimes he writes interesting things, but one of more funnier things was about Rahul Gandhi's clothing choices. And so he wrote this article saying why Rahul Gandhi should start wearing t-shirt and jeans. And here was his sort of the crux of his argument. So he's talking about political rallies addressed by Rahul Gandhi. He's seen rolling up his sleeves while saying, "Dekho bhaiya," in an urbane accent. The sleeves fall again and again, and he has to roll them back several times during a rally speech. And then he poses his sort of punchline. Says that, can a man who can't manage his sleeves manage the country or even a party? And obviously the answer is, obviously no, right? So this is one example in which behavioralism, or a behavioral understanding of politics, is brought into mainstream popular discourses. And some of these kinds of ways of thinking about politics and society are new to many people in India. So they create this kind of enchanting rhetoric and sort of a framework which really mesmerizes people. And these kinds of arguments have become very, very popular. Now, a more serious example is here. So as part of my research in Gujarat in 2009, I was there for the whole calendar year, and I attended 2 rallies addressed by Modi in 2009 as part of the 2009 Lok Sabha elections. I think it was the state election. And in 2 of those rallies in Rajpipla and Panchmahal, he gave this punchline. He said, for 60 years, the Congress party has been doling out hens and goats. मुर्गी और बकरी से काम चला रहे हैं. आदिवासी विकास का मतलब है मुर्गी दे दो और बकरी दे दो. और मैं आप सबसे पूछना चाहता हूं कि मेरे आदिवासी भाई फूलों की खेती क्यों नहीं करते? Right? Why shouldn't they aspire to farming and marketing flowers? So this was, this is part of his usual routine that he does in different forms, where he evokes this kind of aspirational India, right? Now, a political scientist read this piece of ethnography that I, shared in the 2014 EPW article, and they used this argument to say that Modi is promoting a neoliberal format of politics. Now, if you know if you understand the framework of neoliberalism, and if you also understand Modi's politics, it's really very hard to make an argument that he's promoting a politics of neoliberalism, right? But this is another example in which these kinds of minute ethnographic observations can be interpreted in a variety of ways. And I'm not questioning, the freedom that scholars have to interpret anything any way they want, but I want to make an argument that in the current context, it's very important that we stick to some understanding of the context in how we do our scholarship. The third and the most sort of serious argument that has been become very popular recently comes in Ajay Gudawarti's book, popular book, India After Modi. And there are several instances like that, which I've sort of recently talked about in a paper that I shared along with the announcement for this talk. And one of those examples has to do with, he talks about Kanhaiya Kumar being attacked in the court premises, right? And then he says and he talks about how many of these lawyers who attacked Kanhaiya Kumar, they feel left out of the political process, right? So lawyers in a Delhi court, they are the people who are feeling left out of the political process. And this should remind you of the similar arguments that are being made about the politics of Trumpism in United States. But anyway, so Ajay argues that it's understandable why various sections of the society have begun to lay premium on security rather than freedom. Right? So he reads the attack by lawyers on Kanhaiya Kumar as a sign that various sections of Indian society are laying a premium on security rather than freedom. Now, obviously, freedom has a very different meaning in the Indian context compared to the dominant discourses on freedom in the US and Europe. And Ajay doesn't spend any words on explaining these contextual differences, either of the concept, the way it has been deployed in different societies, or his interpretation of this particular event as a premium on security over freedom. He just wants us to take his interpretation for given. And if you kind of read, and I don't want, this is the only time I'm going to talk about this particular debate here, but if you read his response to my critique of his arguments, it doesn't read very well. He doesn't like that kind of critique. And this, again, I'm not sharing as a sort of personal spat with Ajay, who I really respect, but as a point about the importance of getting into a culture of public dialogue and debate, right? And in the piece, I make this argument that whose freedom we are talking about and whose security we are concerned about. And what is at stake here, right? Kanhaiya Kumar, lawyers, Dalits who are being flogged, or Muslims who are being lynched, right? So the freedom security argument is extremely complex in the current context, and understanding it in its proper context is very, very important. So, and my argument is that part of the problem that you see in this debate between Ajay and me has to do with how political theory looks at the political world, and how scholars of my training, of social science training, and I use that in sort of scare quotes because there are all kinds of arguments about what social science means and what its place is in the critical dialogue. How does it relate to critical scholarship? Are social science arguments a polar opposite to critical social science arguments, and so forth, right? So there's a whole variety of arguments there. And again, we need to get into a discussion on this, so please don't assume anything. I quickly want to make a couple of points about why more of us should actually think about research methods or research approaches, rather than sort of thinking of methods as the lesser mortal social scientists who work on policies and programs think about, right? So there's a certain kind of taboo in critical social science about talking about methods, because methods is what you do when you're doing, like, sort of local research, when you aren't thinking deep enough. When you're thinking deep in certain varieties of political theory, you're not bound by methods or methodological approaches. That's the argument that I'm kind of trying to push against. So I want to start by, and I'm not a political theorist, so I'm using all these arguments in a very instrumental way, and I'm happy to get into a discussion if I'm misquoting something. But Hannah Arendt makes this really important argument, and again, this is a sort of secondary source reading, but it's a direct quote or based on direct quotes from Hannah Arendt. And she argues that in scientific thinking, and she quotes biology, psychology, philosophy, theology, and I actually want to also add anarchist thinking, people who propose anarchist Gandhian alternatives and so forth. There's only man, right? And man in quote, because that was the time. Now we are talking about the human being or individual. So Hannah Arendt is saying that in a variety of scientific thinking, there's a monolithic understanding of man. Right? But politics, her argument is that politics rests on the fact of human plurality. There are different kinds of people. They think in very different ways. Their social, political, and economic locations are very different. The connection between their thinking and their actions varies dramatically from where they are. The same individual, you put them in two different situations, and the connection between thinking and practice, changes very, very significantly. And so Hannah Arendt is arguing that philosophers have taken this notion that man is by nature a political being, when in reality, politics originates in the in-between men. Basically, she's saying that politics is about relating one individual to another individual, individual to the collective, individual to the group, and so forth, right? That's how I read this argument about politics originating in the in-between men, in the sphere that some people have called public sphere. You can think about the social context, political context, and so forth. And then she goes on to make an argument, and this is a critique of Marxist, and I have worked with the same kind of understanding of Marxism, that, or certain varieties of Marxism, because there are different varieties of Marxism. She goes on to say that Western thought has turned politics into history, a world historical process determined by a set of laws, and such thinking has reduced the plurality of human beings to a single undifferentiated humanity, right? And so the classical political philosophy, political theory enterprise is based on this notion of innate human being, right? And even when people think about, let's say, the Indian context, they're thinking about one Indian man or woman. And so there's this approach of thinking about human being in monolithic terms, which creates these kinds of problems of how do you interpret the actions of different individuals located differently in different contexts. And of course, Hannah Arendt's argument, her argument, and again, this is interesting to think about the discussion earlier about the link between freedom and security. Freedom exists only in the peculiar in-between area of politics, right? So the trade-off of freedom and security happens, if at all that is a trade-off, it has to happen in politics. Individuals don't necessarily have the freedom to decide on those kinds of trade-offs. So, and I quoted Hannah Arendt to make two sort of points. One, it is important to think about plurality of individuals. But whenever social scientists, and particularly economists or political economists, make that argument, it's understood as a reductionist approach to methodological individualism. The moment you use the word individual, it is taken as being synonymous with methodological individualism. That's how it is, and I think it's a very lazy way of thinking about the kind of arguments that Hannah Arendt is making about how the game of politics the social question, the political question, emerges in the sphere that rests, that lies in between the individual and the collective in some form. And so that's why I argue that having a model, as in an understanding of what a social and political individual is like, who is it that we are studying, or who is it that we are thinking about, who is it that we are writing about, having that understanding and clarity of understanding is extremely important. And of course, that understanding can vary from one field to another field, but it cannot and it should not be a monolithic understanding of one individual who is behaving in certain ways. So my model of the individual, which actually draws on new institutional economics, some very quote-unquote reductionist parts of social science, but many scholars have worked really hard for decades now to expand those reductionist frameworks to make them smarter in a very critical social science way, right? So, and I'll go through this quickly because we can spend an entire day talking about this. But the way I think about individuals are by and large self-interested. That doesn't mean that they will never think about others. But the point is, in most situations, you can take it for granted that individuals will act out of self-interest, defined very broadly. So when an individual is giving money in a temple or in a donation, people will see this as a reflection of, he's being selfless or she's being selfless. Now, if you know some people who donate in different places and how much they brag about it, you know that donation is not a polar opposite of self-interest, right? There are a variety of self-interests that you can serve by appearing to be other regarding or not self-interested. Individuals' behaviors are context-driven. Think about Indians in India versus Indians abroad. They are goal-oriented individuals, whoever that is, a farmer, a priest, a politician, an academic. Everybody works with certain goal in their life, and we got to understand this, right? And they are relational. We are fundamentally a social being, which means that we see ourselves in relation to other individuals, other groups, and this relational notion of individuality is what politicians actually draw on, right? And so, concepts of relative deprivation or concept of conspicuous consumption, all of these draw on a relational model of individual who wants to achieve certain things in relation to other individuals. And particularly in the Indian context, but also in other places, I think power is an important resource that every individual wants to have access to. And of course, you can think about power in different ways. You can think about relationships within a family, between parents and their children, or between husband and wife, or individuals who are in non-binary relationships. Power is everywhere, and as we think about individuals, we got to be thinking about power as an important currency in human behavior and human relations. The one part of human behavior that non-political scientists and many political scientists actually don't understand is that individuals are deeply strategic and tactical. Like they say, you have small children who know very well how to extract things out of their parents, right? And so they adapt their behavior very, very rapidly to achieve certain things and to what works within their family. So depending on what parental behavior is, children's behavior varies very, very significantly, and part of that has to do with the fact that kids are tactical and strategic in their behavior. And finally, we also need to remember that there are fundamental cognitive limitations to human understanding. Sometimes we don't genuinely know things, and these could be things as serious as racism, right? I've often thought about when you interact with my family members, for example, sometimes they don't even have the concept of racism. There was this debate about the cricketer Sami being called Kallu, and the whole back and forth that happened. I can guarantee you can find literally, somebody in your family or in your close circles who have no idea that when they use these terms, they're being racist, right? And so these kind of cognitive limitations now in the reductionist institutional analysis, cognitive limitations are often understood as lack of information. And so their recommendation is that, educate people, right? Make them aware and you will have different things. But that's not what we are talking about, right? There are genuine cognitive limitations in sort of culturally specified, socially specified ways, specified or conditioned ways of thinking. And in recent times, you heard the discussion of Dunning-Kruger effect, so that people who don't know things, sometimes they don't even realize that they don't know about something, and they behave as if they know a lot. So that's the model of the individual. The other important thing to remember is that people often confuse normative versus the empirical theory. And again, there's a hierarchy. In certain sections of social sciences, normative theory is supposed to be the real theory, and social science theory is supposed to be the sort of the kind of quote unquote lower caste of the theory. But as I've said, theories of all kinds have evolved. People have worked on them, and people have made, tried to make things useful in different contexts that they work on. I really like this this notion of process model that is proposed by Lev and March in a book that was published in 1973. And you can read this as a reductionist text. You can also read this as a text that opens up methodological frameworks. The other important practice that I've developed in my research, and I've done some thinking on this, but I have not written about it, which is that my argument would be that every research enterprise is defined by some normative considerations in mind. And so if there are some non-social scientists here, normative means when you think about how things should be, right? What they ought to look like. We should have equality in the world. We should have a notion of justice that allows all kinds of freedoms to all kinds of people, right? So all of that is, whenever we are thinking in should terms, that's the normative argument or a normative way of thinking about things. When you think about what actually exists out there in the world, that's called positive. And often these things are presented as polar opposites. And like everything else, I don't think that normative and positive can be separated very easily. People who think about free markets, economists, 97.5% of economists, that's not a survey-based data, but my general impression that when they think about free market, they have a normative model in mind. But you tell an economist that your model of market is a normative model, and they'll go berserk, right? So this notion of normative positive needs to be understood in a very different way than it is typically understood. But every researcher is driven by some kind of normative considerations. You can take those normative considerations and you can conduct a research which is more or less positively structured, where you're genuinely trying to understand what the reality looks like, which includes being interpretive about subjective understandings that individuals bring to the table, right? But you can do that research on subjective understandings in a positive way, right? And so, and then once you're done with your research, you can come out with, again, you can come out with normative implications. So what does this say about how we can achieve equality in society, right? So normative, positive, normative. There's my advisor, Lynn Ostrom, who, as I mentioned in the blurb that I shared, she was a political scientist who was the first woman to win an economics Nobel Prize. So I come from a house of interdisciplinary craziness, if you would call it, right, as we understand it in Indian philosophy. But she actually gave this idea that frameworks, theory, and models, they're very different things, and they mean something, and then you can use them in particular ways. And people often don't get into those discussions and often confuse those things, which is actually not helpful. So Lev and March gave this process model of doing social science. And their argument was, when you're looking at a data or an observation, think of that data or observation as a result of an entire process that has unfolded before you actually get to that data or observation. Right? And obviously you can, anyone who has thought about research methods, you can think about how this can be actually reduced to a very reductionist notion of data collection and data analysis. You can also use the same argument to actually have a much richer understanding of the research enterprise. Because if you think of your data or your observation as being a product of a specific historical, political, social, cultural context, all of those features of the context are part of the process that led to that particular data or that particular observation. And I make all of these arguments in this particular moment in history, where as scholars, as intellectuals, as writers, we need to be accountable to one another. We cannot behave as philosopher kings or king philosophers who, so this idea of enlightenment era, that there are these philosophers who will think deeply about the world, they'll go to a cave and they'll come out with very deep ideas about the world and they will enlighten everybody. I'm sorry, we are not in that world anymore. As scholars, as thinkers, we are accountable to other scholars and we are accountable to the people who we are writing about and the people who we are trying to serve in some ways, if indeed that is our goal, right? And I assume that most of us don't do scholarship just for the sake of filling up pages. I hope so. I think, given how much longer I've already taken on all these kinds of meta discussions, I will kind of run very quickly through this whole argument of institutional analysis. But let me say that institutions are defined in a way that is very different from how mainstream political science thinks about institutions, where you think about the RBI, for example, as an institution, or you think about the Supreme Court as an institution. In the new institutional economics, or all different varieties of institutions, you think about institutions as set of rules, norms, and conventions that are widely understood and are socially accepted. And I've sort of, italicized the socially accepted part because many a time, even many institutional scholars miss that part. That the stop sign being a good example, you go and put up a stop sign in Chandni Chowk and see what happens. Nothing happens, right? So stop sign is not an institution it's not a set of rules that is widely understood and accepted in India, but it is a set of rules. It's a symbol, a set of rules, do's and don'ts that are very widely understood and accepted here in the US, for example, right? So institutions, when you think of institutions as such, it allows you a great deal of analytical leverage in understanding how humans respond to different kinds of cues from society and politics. But if you take it out of context, you can actually do violence to the whole notion of institutions. There are a variety of different ways in which the original new institutional economics has been enriched by scholars who identify themselves as historical institutionalists, and there are others who identify themselves as political and economic institutionalists. In my book, I've developed a framework that I call as political economy of institutions. So there are thousand flowers actually blooming in the area of institutional analysis, and it's extremely rich area of research to look into, which sort of allows us to create a dialogue between structures and individuals. You can look at specific historical trajectories, and you can think about an individual and explain why an individual thinks about, let's say, professor-student relationship in a particular way, right? There's a historical trajectory to academia in India. There's a historical trajectory to academia in US, and that trajectory looks very, very different in Europe, right? So this kind of framework allows you to account for the context, both historical and contemporary context, but it also allows you to think about the individuals, the plurality of individuals, as they would behave when they are put in different kinds of political and economic context. And so thinking about the context within which individuals live and the context within which they are trying to survive, that is extremely important for understanding their behavior, right? And in a way that actually shows the way to a future that we all would like to chart in one way or the other. The last point that I want to make about institutions is about the role of the state. And again, the reductionist followers of institutional analysis, they sometimes take institutions as a replacement for state. And so, there was this popular argument, which has already kind of gone out of fashion, institutions matter. And that argument was actually an indirect attack on the state as an important institution or a composite institution that brings together many different kinds of institutions. But one particular way of thinking about state actually comes out of the institutional tradition, which is to think about the state as the sheet anchor of a society. So when we talk about stop sign, people follow stop signs because if you don't, there's a $200 fine, right? Now, if you were living in a country where rules are never followed and you can actually breach a stop sign and you are not fined, in 10 days you will see that nobody is following the sign. But people follow signs here because they know there's a steep sign. They also know that there's a state somewhere out there who's going to catch you either today or tomorrow. So this threat, this credible threat that the state will come and get you if you violate the rules of society actually is fundamental to the working of these kinds of institutions, the working of the institutions as thought about as rules, norms, and conventions. Now, if you don't believe that something is going to happen to your behavior, then you can actually go and lynch somebody. So thinking about institutional politics and the role of the state in promoting certain outcomes or preventing certain outcomes or allowing certain outcomes, again, you can use the framework in a critical way so that it allows you some window into a very, very complex social reality. And then you can actually take different kinds of social realities and then compare them from this kind of meta theoretical perspective of thinking about this kind of expanded notion of institutions. And as I've argued, this is extremely important in large complex societies such as ours. It's more important thinking about these kinds of connections, more important there compared to, say, societies that are already broadly institutionalized, right? So I was, on my way to office here, I was listening to this discussion about comparison between the policing in US versus policing in UK. And the argument that was being made there was that in US, it seems that the policing is about a blind enforcement of law at all times. And the commentator, I don't know if they were saying, it is accurate or not, but they were arguing that in UK, policing is more about making sure that peace is maintained. And so he was making an argument that sometimes to ensure that peace is maintained, you actually need to not enforce a particular law in a particular way, right? And so, the more complex an argument gets, I would argue that, this thinking of institutions and the relationship between individuals and structures becomes even more important and not less so important as some people have argued. I've written about this from a local perspective and how this is an argument about how power relations operate within what looks like situations of collective action. And here I've engaged with and critiqued the work of my own PhD advisor. And unfortunately, she passed away before this was published, but otherwise she would have been very, very happy about this argument. This slide here is just a way of showing how you relate the structure and individuals in a methodological way. It's an entire framework. You can look at different parts of the framework given different kinds of research objectives. I won't get into it. I've developed it to some extent, and I'm continuing to work on this in the book. That is also, this is the cover from the 2018 publication, India-based publication, and it's available on Amazon. Please do take a look if you're interested in these kinds of debates. I've also applied it to the context of, let me talk about this in just a minute to use this as an example of how structures and individuals can and cannot and should not be related. So in environmental economics, or in one very influential area of environmental economics, environmental outcomes are explained as an aggregation of individual choices, right? So the argument is that if you're rich, you can afford to pay for environmental cleanliness. And so this argument draws basically on individual behavior, that if you're rich, you can afford to live in a clean place, you can afford to create a garden, or you can afford to pay your government so that they can clean up your pollution, right? So the argument is based on individual behavioral assumptions, and that argument is then sort of aggregated without any kind of intermediate sort of explanation. It's aggregated to explain and investigate national level outcomes. So you'll see hundreds of papers that explain national level environmental outcomes based on this assumption that if you have rich individuals, they'll care more for the environment. If you have poor individuals, they'll care less about the argument, less about the environment. Now, if you think in the context of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, obviously this argument is completely bogus, right? But you'll see that there are all kinds of sophisticated methodological tools that people have developed, and they've justified these arguments to sort of make arguments about national level outcomes of environmental outcomes or environmental quality and so forth. So in this paper that you see on your screen, it's published in Ecological Economics, I've taken on that orthodoxy. It has actually become an orthodoxy of relying on methodological individualism to explain national level outcomes. And I argue that you have to think about how preferences of individuals are shaped by and are mediated by, are aggregated by an entire political process. And that political process varies from one country to another country. So you cannot assume that you can aggregate individual preferences and actually make philosophy about national level outcomes of environmental quality. And so I propose make an argument about how democracy, inequality, and environmental outcomes are related. And I provide an entire sort of setup to sort of justify my arguments. Now, remember that this kind of critical argument is still rooted in rational choice theory broadly defined, right? Which draws on the expanded model of the individual that I talked about earlier. So, and I want to use this as an example to say that if you draw on rational choice theory, you can still be critical, right? Maybe you will not be as critical as the scholars of race, ethnicity, and politics, but there are ways in which you can be more or less critical. There are ways in which you can use these kinds of framework to eliminate different kinds of debates in the social sciences. So to come to the ongoing discussions of power and resistance in the context of authoritarianism, I'll plan on concluding in next 5 minutes. So there was supposed to be, right, so this is the paper that we started a working group on power and institutions in around 2009, and we met over multiple conferences, got into groups. I convened that group, and then in 2019 we brought out this special issue of World Development called Rethinking Power and Institutions in the Shadows of Neoliberalism. And again, you see how these binaries are being broken here. People who talk about neoliberalism in a critical way, they don't necessarily draw on rational choice theories. Similarly, people who talk about power, at least in some critical social science fields, they don't use something like institutions as part of their scholarship. But here is a piece where we brought all of this together, and we developed what we call as the power matrix, which brings together the very complex and sometimes convoluted if you know about theories of power in social science, you know that it's extremely complex in terms of thinking about the agency of individuals, who can speak on whose behalf. Notions of false consciousness come into practice. Whole structure agency debate is up for grabs. So there are all kinds of complications in this literature, and if we wanted to speak to people who work on global development or international development, many of them haven't read those kinds of critical social science theories. So we distilled these theories into this, what we call as the power and institutions matrix, or power matrix, where on the top row you see what are called as the three faces of power. So Stephen Luke had a very influential book where he talked about three different faces of power. We didn't want to use the faces notion because, again, it sort of individualizes power. So we call it sort of three dimensions of power: overt power, which deploys coercion or violence; agenda power, which relies on controlling public sphere or the debate and discussions of different topics in a public sphere, or preventing certain kinds of debate. That's called agenda power. And then you have the discursive power. That's where hegemony is located, where you either create the discourses and narratives and make sure that a large majority of people actually believe in those discourses and narratives. And so whatever your way of explaining the world is, it becomes hegemonic. And this was explained very nicely in a book called Power and Powerlessness, I think, by John Gaventa. It's a book about Appalachia, coal mining in Appalachia, and he talks about how the coal miners came to respect the coal, the capitalists, the owners of coal mines, who were responsible for their poor health, their poverty, and all kinds of bad outcomes. Right? So these, on the top, you see those three kinds of power, but we argue that it's not just enough to think about three kinds of powers. We have to think about the different mechanisms through which any of these kinds of power dimensions can be used. So on the top here, on the left, you see structural or institutional power, which relies on the institutions or structures of the state, economy, and we give all of those examples to understand how structural power, for example, intersects with discursive or ideational power, where you have an entire country's media promoting a certain kind of discourse. They're reinforcing particular kinds of structures in a society. And those structures, again, can be structures of thought, or they can be structures of power around caste or around a leader and so forth, right? And then on the at the bottom of the table, so this was supposed to be one whole table in the paper. On the top, you saw the structural power, which was right, those the dominant way of thinking about power, which is the structural power, and how each of those three modes of power operate through structural means. And at the bottom, we have what we call as the power two. So if you think about structural power as power over other people, at the bottom, what you see is power two, which is that how do different groups, individuals, or constituencies exercise different kinds of powers. And so that's, we call power two. At the bottom, it has one whole section about counterpower or resistance. And again, counterpower or resistance can deploy any of those three means. Counterpower and resistance can be coercive. It can create a violent situation, and it can overpower certain leaders or certain powerful actors and agency at times. But it can also use agenda power and discursive power in different ways, particularly when such counterpower or resistance is aided by organized social movements. Now, what that means, so I'll skip that slide to make sure that my audio doesn't come here. It comes from some other presentation. So I really want to talk about co-optation. And this is really important in the context of what's going on right now. we think of co-optation, and we had a debate about this, and we finally sort of agreed to put it under power to as opposed to power over, right? Because if you think about how co-optation works, it creates different kinds of inducements to co-opt weaker power in the service of agendas or interests that powerful actors have. So if you actually look at it from the vantage point of the weaker individual who's being co-opted, they're at least getting something in return. And to the extent that they agree to or they decide to accept the means of co-optation, they are exercising certain kinds of power too. And in explaining this, I sometimes use another example from Indian context, that you have a manual scavenger who is forced to continue to do manual scavenging because that's the only mean of survival that they can afford in their particular given context. Now, if an exploitative, very exploitative, somebody who actually doesn't even pay as much as somebody earns, let's assume, let's play devil's advocate. They don't even pay as much as what somebody earns by doing manual scavenging. But they argue that I'm going to pay less than what you're getting out of your manual scavenging job, but I'm going to give you a clean room. I'm going to give you a respected, dignified existence out in the company town. You'll be my slave in a sense, but I won't call you my slave. You will have outwardly looking, respectable, dignified life. The manual scavenger may happily actually take up that offer. So that's co-optation. Now, it's important to remember I'm not advocating for those kinds of outcomes, because in the long run, maybe the individual will be worse off. But if the individual actually decides to take up that inducement, they are signing on to this project of co-optation. And that's why we think of this as a form of power to, as opposed to, obviously it is both, right? To co-opt somebody who has to have some kind of resources and power, but it's productive to think of co-optation as power to as opposed to being power over. And again, I also want to use this example to illuminate how one can use different kinds of theories and frameworks to get into a very nuanced discussion of a complex social reality. And so my plea here is, let's never go by the labels. Let's get into conversations with people who are trying to make sense of complex reality, just as you are trying to do. Now, in the next slide, I was going to explain the framework of political intermediation, and I make an argument that social movements, activists, the anarchist way of thinking about social mobilization it's very, very counterproductive. Partly because it does exactly the same thing that the corporate neoliberals do, which is that they forget that there's a state out there. So anarchists as well as corporate neoliberals both don't recognize the state, but for very, very different reasons. Now, in critical literature on decentralization, there's, for example, political economist Pranab Bardhan has made this argument that under many conditions, the exploited, oppressed masses may actually want the assistance of the state. And so you can't always think of the state as this, as the tradition in the West is, to think of the state as Uncle Sam who's out there for your neck. Right? State has an extremely important role in taking us from point A to point B. And when we make reference to the state here, we're not necessarily referring to what the state is like right now, but we are referring to the spaces for social and political action, which one allows a reimagining of the social contract or a reimagining of what we want in our society, and then not just reimagining it, but enacting it. The only way you can enact large-scale social change in any civilized society, and I use that word very, very carefully, not in a normatively loaded way, the only way you can enact social change in a civilized society is through the tools of the state. The rule of law, the state, because the state is the only one, it's a reflection of our collective understanding, our collective vision for what we want to be. It's a very bad reflection, it's a very bad tool, but just like democracy, there's no alternative to the state when we want to think about large-scale social change. So, right, so and my argument is that, we need a new concept to understand of this working of relationship between the state and different kinds of interest groups in society, including the social movements. And I call it mechanisms of political intermediation. In the book, I've used the examples from India, Tanzania, and Mexico, both cross-national comparisons, but over time comparisons, to see how these mechanisms of political intermediation work. And my argument is it's basically a way through which actors in state, society, and politics, they negotiate with one another as to what is it that we want, either in the area of social justice, or in the area of environmental politics, or in the area of health politics, and they come to some kind of conclusions. Those conclusions don't make everybody happy, but this is kind of a critical pluralism model. The old pluralism model, again, was based on this kind of reductionist notion of atomistic society, but I'm arguing that we can use that same model, expand it to account for the fact that we don't live in atomistic world or atomistic society. We live in societies that are complex and that are unequal, but we need that model. We need that model to understand how we can think collectively about different kinds of socio-political outcomes. The person that you see on your right is Cardenas, who was the president of Mexico, and he set up these peasant leagues and peasant federations at the state level and at the national level, and he created this whole corporatist machinery that served Mexico's peasants really well for a very long time. I would say until about 2000, the year 2000 or so. And then, of course, neoliberalism has also been eating into Mexican politics slowly but surely, but it's a very important history to look at and to learn from. Okay, so I really need to conclude now. I will leave you with some thoughts. In 2014, I wrote of Modi's election as a positive social scientist. I read that piece again after a very long time last night, and I thought I would change one sentence in that whole article if I was writing that article again, but I would still stand by everything else that I said there. And I basically argued that Modi is a smart politician. That was the crux of the argument, even though some of this was kind of lost in editing and all of that. And I think I would still say that if we don't think of Modi as a smart politician, we cannot even begin to try and think about the counter or the responses to his politics. But something very fundamental has happened in the intervening 6 years, and it's very comparable to what has happened in the US. And my Indiana University professor, Jeffrey Isaac, he's a great public intellectual, and he has made this argument that we, as in political scientists, we need a new concept. And he's come up with this new concept that he has shown in the double quotes here. And in this article, he explains why we political scientists should start using this new concept. Part of his argument is, he's being provocative, but part of his argument is that if our scholarship does not speak to the people, our scholarship is worthless in some ways, right? And again, I don't, that's not the word I would normally use, but he's kind of making that very serious argument about the role of scholar as a public intellectual. And he's been very active. He writes a blog almost every week. Do check him out particularly if you're interested in the US politics and what's going on. So how do we think about future? First of all, I think we need to stop looking for shortcuts. So there's, different variants of this argument, you will see that we need to think about a non-Brahmanical form of Hinduism, some kind of religious philosophy that will bring everybody together. The majoritarian majority will be an enlightened majority. I think that's a bogus argument. And it's a bogus argument because if you studied Kabir, and if you studied how Kabir actually metamorphoses into different kinds of Kabirs as it travels into the folk lore. And so I've studied Kabir in Kawant, which is a tribal area in southern Gujarat. And basically Kabir has been reduced to a devta there. It's a deity. There are, this is also true for parts of Rajasthan. I have lots of stories because my mother used to be a Kabir Panthi, and so I used to go to these Kabir, satsangs. So I can tell you a lot about Kabir and how it is actually practiced and understood by people. So no, that will not save us. We have this argument by Amartya Sen, argumentative Indian. I think we should see that argument as a normative argument, as something that we should aspire for, and each one of us should do whatever we can to promote the practice of arguments, both in scholarship and among citizenship and between scholars and citizens. Third, and many of these points actually draw on the books that I show on the side. These are books about fascism and tyranny. And there's a rich debate in India about how should we read the current moment. But these are some of the action points that come out of those kinds of works. And so whether we use the label of fascism or not, I think all of these action points are still valid. One very important point is that we, as in the opposition parties, the scholars, the activists and intellectuals, have failed to make the pain of people count in politics. And so I'm obviously referring to demonetization. I'm referring to the lockdown, the extended lockdowns. So all of these pains that are being inflicted on the common people, those pains are being cleverly redirected against the intellectuals, against the opposition party. And so that's a major failure. And in these books, you'll see that this management of pain is an important part of the project of dictators and tyrants. And we should start thinking about it. I also want to argue that without thinking about the welfare state and an effective welfare state, not just a rhetorical welfare state. And I talk about this in the 2014 EPW article, that we have failed. The welfare state has fundamentally failed. And so for many people, at least in 2014, the BJP didn't look any different from Congress, except for the fact that BJP looked promising because it hadn't been tested in the same way as Congress had been tested. And so finally, again, to remember that politics is slow and strong boring of hard bones. It's hard work. Let's not get into these kinds of discursive arguments where we are trying to churn out new phrases to create some kind of exciting arguments. The only thing that will work is engage, organize, and mobilize. That's our job for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kashwan sir, for this wonderful presentation. I think it really kept us glued throughout. And I more or less agree with your statement that you made, that Modi is a smart politician, and it's high time for us to accept this fact, to understand and shape our future political process. So on that note, I open this house for question and answers. I request all of you, if you have any questions, you're welcome to pose them to Professor, who will address your questions. You can question by just switching on your microphone and your video and ask your question, or either you can just type it out on the chat box and it can be read forward.
Hi, Prakash.
Yeah, Arvind has a question.
Yeah, means it is just a form of comment as well, and it would be a question. Like, means Prakash, during demonetization, when demonetization happened, I was traveling in North India, in my hometown, and which is in eastern Uttar Pradesh and Awadh region, which is Ambedkar Nagar district. And I found at that time, means poor people or lower middle class people were very happy with the demonetization. And one reason behind this, in my inquiry, I found that there were perception that they thought that, okay, we have not lost anything. Actually, it is rich class or elite class which has lost, which have lost means their money. And what was most interesting thing for me, like when I came back from the tour and came back to my university, JNU, we had a certain framework of understanding that what does elites count. So for us, elite means Ambani, Adani. So we were thinking that whether it is benefiting Ambani or Adani, Ambani or not. So, but while interrogating to the people, means to ordinary people, their reference was just their neighbor. So like somebody in the city. So their argument was that, looks, this person has lost. So somebody immediate kind of rivalry. And I think that means the right-wing parties have very smartly managed that, or they were able to create a sense at least that, look, your immediate neighbor, somebody who is who actually has lost or who is suffering out of that. So it seems to me that in human nature, means lot of, means you have tried to expand in your initial initial section of your presentation, when you were trying to define the idea of human nature. So you have tried to take up the you have tried to enlarge the idea of human nature from just, which comes from just from normative theory, to the idea of nature, which also idea of human nature, which comes from the behavioral politics as well. So could you also think of incorporating this idea of human nature in this kind of things as well, where people are enjoying not because of the pain and suffering of their pain and suffering, but also because of the pain and suffering of others? And means there is possibility that political parties or leaders could infuse those kind of sentiments, but there exist I think such kind of sentiments now.
So maybe I can, is it okay if I collect a couple of questions, and then maybe, if somebody has a related question, we can take a couple of questions and then go on.
Sure.
Right. Thank you. Those were wonderful comments and questions, and I think it's good to take those up, and then we get into a second round of discussions. So to Arvind, to start with the point that you made about people being sort of jealous of their neighbors, and so the pain, it was not so much of their own pain that they were happy about, but their neighbor's pain. The point that comes out of this scholarship that on fascism is not about people enjoying their pain. It is that historian Timothy Snyder, who's written this book on tyranny, he has argued that management of pain is a central project for authoritarian leaders or tyrants. And so what we see in the Indian context is actually, it doesn't contradict your argument, but the point is that the pain is being deflected in a way or it is being managed in such a way that it gets directed against the intellectuals, the distant elites, or the Congress party, the opposition party, and so forth, right? So there may be a variety of other elements that come into play in any complex reality, but the project of the tyranny is that you create pain, and then you use that pain to paint other people in a bad light. So, if you did demonetization, it was the strong action of this leader versus the money non-action of other leaders. If you did the lockdown at a notice of 4 hours, this is again a reaffirmation of your being. Look, he's such a strong leader. He doesn't care. 4 hours, nothing doing, just go sit in your home. I mean, I can imagine a lot of people actually using precisely those words, right? And so the pain is being managed in a way so that it becomes a source of resentment against the incompetent leaders, against the past governments, against the soft intellectuals, against the seculars or whatever. It can be managed in different ways. Delhi riots and its timing, has to tell you about their ability to manage pain in a way that extracts them just the right kind of benefit without actually hurting them. Otherwise, imagine, who would actually think of letting Delhi riots unfold while the international media was in Delhi to cover the Trump visit, right? So I think, and I'm only beginning to get into this area of reading and thinking, but I think we have to take this idea very, very seriously in terms of how the pain of common people is being redirected against the enemies, and they're literally labeled as enemies of the state. So with that, let me get into some of the comments made by Professor Thakur. Thank you so much. This was really, and I know I heard you talk about Kabir, and I said this will be the good point to sort of talk about. Starting with this point about how do we manage methodological individualism, which is open to a complex social reality. I think it's a decision that researchers with different inclinations make based on their own understanding of the trade-off between being parsimonious, as in for those of you who are not used to this language, being parsimonious as in you work with as fewer variables as you can, versus speaking to the reality. So there's always a trade-off between how parsimonious or thin or quote-unquote smart your arguments can be without becoming overly descriptive, versus how well you can actually address a complex question. And so I agree in terms of there being this kind of tussle there. The model of the individual that I laid out on the PowerPoint is what I use. And so that's broadly a expanded model of rational choice, bounded rational choice, located within a contextual understanding of individuals' wisdom and individuals' interest in pursuing certain kinds of arguments. Roy Bhaskar, he's been suggested, and the book it should be right here somewhere on the shelf here, but I haven't managed to read it yet. So I'll make sure I'll do that in next month or so. On the question of peer group and scholars actually sort of getting into this echo chamber, that was precisely actually my point. So there are two things that come out of that discussion. One is that if we don't want to remain in an echo chamber, we should welcome different kinds of arguments, different kinds of critiques. So that's just between us, scholars, academics, and so forth, researchers, right? So when a critique comes our way, it's our responsibility, not just for the sake of the occupation of academics and intellectuals, which requires you to be open to critique, but also it's our social responsibility in the current moment, because we should come up with the best arguments we can in a collective. And so in that sense, I think, it's such a wonderful thing to have a group such as Foundation for Creative Social Research, which creates these kinds of opportunities for different kinds of scholarly exchanges, so that echo chambers can be broken from within, as in by engaging in these kinds of discussions and debates. But echo chambers, when we need to actually talk to the public, we need to make sure that we are, one, utilizing a language that is, sure, it has to be abstract in the sense that it shouldn't be a reductionist, technical, boring language that nobody other than the writer actually reads, right? So that's one extreme of it. You cannot just run models and come up with regression coefficients. The other extreme is to become so abstract and so aloof that what you're saying actually sounds really exciting. Freedom versus security, wow, it's such an attractive argument. But what does it mean to Kanhaiya Kumar? What does it mean to the Dalit who's being lynched? Or the Muslim who's being lynched? And so, I emphasize this responsibility of being transparent with our vocabulary, so that we can understand one another and we can get into arguments. But these arguments should also be meaningfully understood by the general public. The goal should not be to sort of wow everybody with kind of flowery language that is common in certain fields of scholarship more than other fields of scholarship. And so I think that's where I'm trying to understand, how do we write about these kinds of complex realities, which is philosophically rich, which is socially critical, and which is empirically robust, right? So there are all of these different goals that we need to bring together to create the kind of scholarships that will actually speak to the most critical questions of our time, as well as it will speak to the masses who we should really be engaging with in this kind of a broader dialogue. So that's the argument, and I fully agree that we need to be both abstracting out and being accessible. But as you can imagine, there are n ways of being abstract, and there are n ways of being more accessible. And somebody who's better than I am at math can do the calculation of what n raised to n makes, all those different kinds of permutations and combinations. And we should collectively work to work out the best possible permutation combinations. Thank you for sharing that history about the institutional debates and the comparative project with John Harris. I would really appreciate, digging into some of that literature, what came out of that comparative research, especially because, I'm really, really interested in sort of thinking comparatively about Latin America and India, because Latin America has a much longer history of movements and revolutions, and we barely have a tradition like that, except for a few cases here and there. So I think we should be learning from one another. Latin America is now sort of coming to another situation where neoliberalism is being challenged. So I think this is a particularly interesting moment in that kind of comparative project. Lastly, let me clarify the point about Hinduism and Kabir. Of course, we need Kabir's liberated philosophy and spiritualism. So my argument is not to say that we cannot, we shouldn't have Kabir, or we cannot have Kabir as he articulated in his own words. But the point I'm making is that the Kabir's philosophy, as it travels through the feudal lanes and bylanes of our society, Kabir has been transformed into this devta, this god that he argued against, right? He said, if there's a, both Kabir and, by the way, Kabir and Ghalib said very similar things. That's very interesting. I don't know why that is the case. And sometimes they actually use the same kind of language. I hope there was no plagiarism anywhere. But the point is that the mukt vichardhara of Kabir, the liberating philosophy of Kabir, has been distorted. And that distortion is not, and my argument is that distortion of Kabir and other kinds of enlightened Indian philosophical traditions is not because people are ignorant. I mean, some of them may be ignorant, of course, but the distortion happens in the process where a mahant, so Kabir Panthis have mahant, or those senior Kabir Panthis who sort of occupy a gadi, And so they create these setups, these organized Kabir Panth sort of religion, which becomes a political economic center. So it's approached by politicians. It becomes a center of wealth and donations, and people go, and that becomes a center of power. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that any religion, any philosophy, however liberating it may be, it has to be thought about as being in a dialectic relationship between our sort of social, kind of the moral balance in our society, and the extent to which inequality is so deeply ingrained in our society that people don't even think about challenging certain kinds of inequalities. And so unless we actually also work on that front, I think liberating philosophies themselves, in and of themselves, as valuable as they are, they may not be effective in this political project, because the political project has to move simultaneously in social, economic, philosophical, and religious sort of fields or areas of our social life and cultural life. So that was the point. So thank you for that, and I really look forward to more discussions.
So we have another question by Rajesh Ramakrishnan, who says that much has been said about the politics of polarization of Modi. The person Modi is seen as above all institutions, all accountability. Any attack on the person or even the policies only goes to his advantage. There is a certain irrationality in this politics which makes rational reflection and proposal of alternatives seem rather useless. What kinds of political practice can break through this impasse?
I know Rajesh. I know Rajesh from a very long time ago. And just to use Rajesh as another example, Rajesh comes out of a sort of NGO or even a research and donor kind of research tradition, and he's increasingly become more and more both, I think, spiritual and as well as more and more critical. So again, a great example of an engaged sort of discussion and dialogue there. I think and I again have to sort of look into what I would think of as sort of the deeper foundation of our society, that values such as tolerance and pluralism and respect for other people's dignity, we have never taken those discussions to the streets. So when somebody abuses a Dalit in parts of Rajasthan and UP, they almost do this as a second nature. And of course, there are times when they want to be really nasty and abusive and, they completely want to engage in a public insulting of some individual. But there are thousands of other moments when racism and casteism is practiced almost almost unthinkingly, right? It's so ingrained in our thinking and in our vocabulary, in our jokes, our social interactions, that we don't even sort of, that's not even a question, and I'm sure many of you got into these conversations. Get into these conversations with your relatives, and especially if they happen to be older than you are, the Indian uncle steps in and says, "अरे क्यों इतना सीरियस होते हो यार, थोड़ा कभी रिलैक्स किया करो तुम, मतलब ये क्या करते जब देखो तब लगा रखी है कुछ." So my point is that this kind of veneration comes out of deep foundations within our society at large. And now again, we're not sort of talking about the enlightened part of our philosophical traditions or religious traditions, but we are thinking about the plebeian, the common foundation of our society, common people, where many of these values are kind of unheard of. When that Delhi, there was a racist attacks in Delhi against people from Africa, and And if you actually listen to some of those really nice interviews that some of the journalists did, and there was some really good reporting around that, I mean, people genuinely believe in the heart of their heart that Africans are inferior. They're like, and it's not just about Africans. So, you could be mistaking this as a argument against the outsider. I was traveling in a rally of Adivasis in Ahmedabad, and I was doing my participant research methodology, so that I was walking on the side of the rally, and from time to time, if there was a stop in the rally, I would stop and I would step into crowds on the side, and I would sort of pretend as if I was also an onlooker, and I would get into sort of cheap talk with them, as you say, halchal pushne wala. And so many times people said, ye madrasi kahan se aa gaye? So I don't know if there are non-Hindi speakers here, but basically they said, if they look at, very dark skinned an alert citizen or activist, to try and get deeper into these kinds of social realities, and then try and find how can we make these people understand that dignity of life is sacrosanct, that you don't go and abuse people just because you think the other person is less powerful or from another caste or whatever. So I think these, and that's why I think, and I've been thinking about these things since, 2000, the Anna Hazare movement, for example. And things have really gotten worse. And so I think if we had started some kind of public dialogues and these kinds of forums way back, probably we would make some progress. Maybe this is high time we start engaging with public at that level. And I think that level of dialogue requires a very different kinds of engagement, maybe non-scholarly engagements as our fellow citizens. Otherwise, we will continue to see, these kinds of leaders being venerated and worshipped in the public sphere. Thank you, Rajesh, for that wonderful question.
Yeah, so am I audible? Yeah, so actually, I wanted to ask. Okay, yeah. Okay, sir. So, 1 second, sir. So I actually wanted to ask about political intermediation. First of all, thank you, sir, for such an interesting presentation. Why am I asking about political intermediation? Because I am interested in how to make this process of political intermediation a substantive one. In the sense that, sir, you said that, okay, we realize that there is political pluralism, but don't you think that in order to make make the results of political intermediation substantive, we have to have a recognition that all the plural actors, all the kind of plurality that is there, they should be at one. There should be a sort of equality with respect to understanding or seeing those actors, be it social movement, be it political parties, be it political institutions. So I was thinking like how to make this process more substantive rather than reducing it to just a ploy of, say, management of pain that you used, or just co-opting these actors, for example, social movements, social activists. Why am I saying this? Because of the fact that when I went to the field and I asked landless people there that what do you think about politics and what do you think about entering into political parties or the political realm, they were so so reluctant to even say that we would be a part of we would ever be a part of any kind of political party or entering the political realm. They said that political क्या था कि political party या politics एक ऐसी जगह है जैसे दलदल, एक बार जाओ तो फंस जाते हो. So I was thinking that how to strike that kind of dialogue and how to break that kind of impasse, those boundaries between between political and social, and yeah, so this is my question. And what my hunch is that that's why I'm focusing on Gandhian social movement, that why aren't the Gandhian social movements thinking about, about more of being, about having a political identity as well, in the sense of conventional political institutions. When you ask them that, you have all the knowledge about the concrete problems of people, and you can really not only change the social but the political as well, if you enter as a political party, as a political leader, they straight away deny it. So why is that, and how to include this kind of mechanism of political intermediation in that process? I hope I'm clear, sir. So yeah.
I don't know how specific the question is, but after listening the presentation, something that came to my mind is the argument that like after all, when we envisage a kind of social change, what should be the focus on? Should it be on changing the structure or reorganizing the structure, or can we be just focus on reforming the individual? So in the contemporary form of politics, if we are envisaging a social change, what we should focus on?
Yeah, I think these two questions go together really well. So before I get into either of those, let me also make this other point that I've been, thinking of writing for some time, but there are so many things to write about. Is this notion of politics as being sort of, an act of selfless. So, the legacy of Gandhi means that a majority of our citizens think of politics in normative terms. If you get into politics, you have to be working selflessly. You have to be a saint. And if they see people who are not, turning out to be saints, then politics is vilified. The entire project of politics is undermined because somebody is not behaving as a saint. Now, of course, we know of people who are villains, and even if they're not being able to label themselves as saints, they're definitely able to avoid being talked about as villains in the public sphere, right? So I'm not getting into that discussion right now, but I think to think of politics in a complex society as a very, in some ways, somewhat mechanical thing. Mechanical thing is that if you go with the assumption that politicians are like any other individuals, they are contextually developed, self-interested actors who will exploit the opportunity to grab political and economic power and resources whenever they can, that should be our starting point for how we structure our politics. And that's where institutions come in as a form of, a check on the worst manifestations of individuals. And so there's an interesting argument to be had, comparing the US under Trump presidency and India under Modi's prime ministership. And I think more people in US were worried about institutions and what will happen to institutions than were the academics who study India. Many of them were very reassured that institutions will save us. What you've actually seen is actually the opposite. The Indian institutions not just have crumbled, in many cases they've simply evaporated into thin air, one would argue. And US institutions are still trying to hold on at some level. There's this, there's this inquiry, there's this Congress, there's this hearings. Floyd gets killed, and a few days after, Floyd's brother goes to Congress to give a testimony, and the whole country is listening to him. Right? So that's another thing that we need to think about. Why is it that our institutions are so weak? And also, what kind of scholarship actually made some scholars to vouch for institutional strength in India, which actually did not exist? And so if you wanted to use the political economy of institutions framework, you would know that India's institutions actually float on very thin air. And they were actually protected by, the Nehruvian vision of what a society should look like. And for a long time, Congress protected it, even though they also undermined it slowly and surely in very significant ways. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I hope both of this was related. On Priya's question about political intermediation mechanism, because this argument is made in a comparative context, I'm drawing on the long history of development of the peasant leagues and peasant federations, and that becoming a means of corporatist politics that the party, the dominant party, played there. So it's a long drawn process. It cannot be created in a short term or even in a medium term. I think if we wanted to think about a solid political intermediation mechanism, we're looking at least about a 20-year long project. But of course, it's not all or nothing. We can start by creating something such as the NAC, National Advisory Council. This was a great example where social activists, politicians, and policymakers came together. They developed joint ideas. They wrote actual bills, debated.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so you made this point that there is a lot of onus on the Indian on intellectuals and scholars to communicate with the masses and disseminate knowledge and knowledge about the functioning of democracy in a very lucid manner, in a manner in which is more communicative rather than only trying to have flowery writings. But my question is, how do you ensure that in an era of social media, in an era of fake news, where people tend to rely more on technological, where people consume news or consume their kind of information from social media platforms, and sometimes fake news also propagates, and there is less attention to at least scholarly writings, at least among the common mass, or what you call mass in the sense. So how do you what is the mechanism that you suggest in that particular milieu then? How do you then disseminate? What is the kind of the tool that you are suggesting? Okay.
Hi, yeah, I'm here. I just want to raise one point. I think if I have followed him correctly, he has a kind of liberal notion of state. The state is like impartial. State is like welfare state. But I think state, if we follow his methodology also, state should also be understood through various structures. And various processes it does perform. So I think we'll have to see the state as a power itself, as a power structure which is well rooted in the social in the power structure. That's the point.
Thank you. Yeah, I can take both of those questions. So Priyanka, that's a very important question, and it's so coming straight to, other than doing our research in ways that, both allows us to keenly understand and intimately understand the intersubjective understanding of different ideas in our society, and also writing our research in forums and venues, doing more newspaper editorials, especially those of us who are, sort of freed from the, also mentioned in the 2014 EPW article that, where I used the evolution of state level politics in Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat to do some prognosis about where we are heading. And so my argument was that if you want to actually think about a Congress Mukt Bharat, BJP has already done that in 3 states. And so we should be studying those 3 states. And I was drawing on fantastic studies that have been done by a number of scholars, including by Professor Sudha Pai. And that sort of tells us that, there were these kinds of mechanisms where Congress worked with Gandhian movements who were present at the grassroots level, and they played some kind of role of intermediary between the masses and the Congress party. And so the calm movement in Gujarat, which is again documented in the 2014 EPW article, is a great example, which built on this kind of a political intermediation mechanism, but it was eaten from inside because, one, the Gandhians don't have the right kind of political philosophy. Sorry, I'm making a broad statement, but I'm happy to sort of defend that. And that happens partly because many Gandhians, if not most Gandhians, have this kind of notion of, do-gooders. And do-gooders never actually do any good in a political sense. They can do something to get some poor people respite from some urgent problems, help them, but that's not, do-gooder is not a political project. And so I think Gandhians are undermined by this, by and large, right? I'm not making a sweeping generalization here, but by and large, the Gandhians that I've seen operating in Gujarat and in Rajasthan, they are undermined by this kind of do-gooder project. So thank you for those insightful questions. Saras, I think it has to be a two-way process. So thinking about the National Advisory Council, Kerala is a great example actually, where there's been a long history of sort of deliberations with people in different ways, with party, with local cadre. Kumbhashri program, which is being talked about in the context of COVID, is another example where you have these kinds of relationships between women groups and party cadres and bureaucrats at the local level. The problem with all of these examples is that because we are so used to, in general, there's so much of currency to talk about that magic silver bullet. The moment you cite this kind of example, people will go and say, no, it doesn't work like that. But the point is not that it works perfectly, but the point is that it gives us a way of thinking about what the relationship between a party and people's organization and the general people should look like, and how bureaucrats are sort of, are disciplined by that kind of relationship. Because at the end of the day, bureaucrats are supposed to serve our politics, they are supposed to serve our society, and that service can happen only if we have active sort of cadre-based engagement at the grassroots level, where you can get information from the grassroots as to what is happening there, and you can also get feedback about what's working and what's not working. And so I think, if there's a blessing in disguise in this massive tragedy that we have in the context of COVID, and it's only beginning to take shape now, I think the blessing in disguise is the Kerala example, where you have the government systems, that there are particular kinds of systems, but because they learn from these kinds of past problems, and you have a relationship between the government and cadre, and you have a certain kind of leadership which has a particular kind of socially egalitarian project that they are pursuing.